Good morning, all. I'd like to preach just for a few moments on the most unpopular virtue in the Christian Catholic life, and that is obedience. Why is this so hard? When I was growing up, I grew up in a family about an hour east of here in the country of Wisconsin, and my next door neighbor, his name was Peter. We were both the same age, best friends, all throughout growing up. We did everything together. But of course, my parents, obviously we were growing up, so we did a lot of things wrong, so occasionally they would have to punish us. And one summer when I was 12, I had done something wrong. Peter had actually simultaneously done something wrong. And so we were both punished in a similar way, where we were both grounded. And one of the aspects of the grounding is we were not allowed to see each other. So of course, what did I do? I didn't want to do that. Didn't want to be obedient to my rules of being grounded. So I secretly, crept over to Peter's house, was kind of throwing rocks at his window. He immediately crawled out of his window. We went kind of crawling off into the woods. We're like, we felt so good to be so bad. Like we're being disobedient. Like this, we're actually speaking together. And we're not supposed to speak together. So actually it was kind of like somewhat exhilarating. You're like, we're free. We're able to do the things what we're not supposed to do. So we're like, well, what are we going to do with our time? So we're like, let's go exploring. So we went off. It's like we were 11, 12 years old. We were exploring in the woods. And I remember we were walking through the woods, and we were going by this cornfield, and we saw this skunk. And I don't know, for whatever reason, we're like, we've always wanted a pet skunk. And as a 12-year-old, I remember thinking irrationally, we can tame this skunk. And so my friend Peter and I, we kind of surrounded it. We kind of cornered it in this area of the cornfield in a rock pile. And in the very distant background of my memory, I remember my dad's words, never corner a wild animal. But of course, I suppressed that. Wasn't thinking about that. And so we kind of were cornering, like, let's just get behind it. The skunk was plenty happy to let that happen. And it was like, oh yes, you want to go behind me? I remember the tail lifting. And I had this awareness that I'm like, oh yeah. I remember thinking it was a moment of enlightenment. I didn't have that thought before at all. It was only when the tail started lifting. And then this white spray, very wide, it was like the wide aspect of your hose, your garden hose, hit both Peter and I. It was like, and if you've ever passed a skunk on the road, when it's dead in a ditch, and you're like, oh, that's a bad smell. Oh, that skunk died. It's nothing. It's nothing like when you are sprayed with the actual spray. It's not a dead animal at a distance. It's the spray on your body. So we're like, it was actually hard to breathe. And of course, we're like, this is not working out very well. And so we both started stumbling back to the house, and we're trying to process just what happened. Let's not do that again. Oh, yeah. And then it slowly started to materialize the plight we were in. Oh no. So our plan was to just be very secret and very safe and just kind of play it off. And so Peter went one way, back to his house, and I went to another. My mom smelled me before I got even into the house. It's like, what is that? I hear her out in the house through the open window. She's like, what is that smell? And she came out and immediately was just started spraying me down. You saw a skunk, just gave me all this lineup. Didn't your dad tell you? I'm like, yes, I was never supposed to corner a wild animal and all this kind of stuff. My mom was like, okay, take this lye soap. We're going to have to go to Fleet Farm. We're going to get some soap and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, I can deal with this. I think I can. The problem was, Peter went to his house. And his dad and my dad were also good friends. And so after Peter got hosed down, Joseph, his father, came wandering down to probably have a beer with my dad on the front porch. It's like, man, it was the craziest thing. Peter, he just smelled like a skunk today. It's going to take him a week to get over that. My dad's like, interesting. So then things got much, much, much worse. And we had a big sit down I remember my dad saying, do you see the fruits of your disobedience? And again, it was just a moment of enlightenment. Yes. But I remember my dad was kind of giving me the fatherly coaching. He's like, we didn't give you these rules to torture you. We didn't give you these rules of grounding to as if I was angry and just wanted you to be in pain. It's they were for your good. And do you see what happens, or what can happen, when you go your own way? It was so simple, And my dad actually probably was trying to calm his anger. But I remember him actually being very calm but deliberate. Like, do you see the effects of your choices, of your disobedience? Wouldn't it have been better for you just to take the grounding? Like, yes. And to this day, I mean, like, I've never cornered the wild animal sense. No, all those things. But like, why is obedience so hard? Like, this is the whole theme of the readings. And it's one of the most unpopular virtues in the Christian Catholic life. To be obedient, it almost seems like to be an obedient Catholic, almost, I hear it, I'm like, I don't want to be a robotic person. That's not obedience. But sometimes we can be deeply fearful of it. Like, it's almost going to make me rigid and without a personality. That's not what obedience is. I remember growing up working for my dad. We all worked for my dad. We had a nursery farm business. And especially growing up, especially in your teens, you hate working for your dad sometimes. Especially because you're always kind of thinking, he's just like making it unusually difficult for me when he would give me rules and things like that. As I got older, something definitively shifted. I no longer said, I'm working for my dad. I'm working with my dad. And that happened when I was about 17, 18. I remember my dad and I were building an addition on the house together. And I remember he was showing me how to use the nail gun and how to make measurements on these to fit, how the windows fit. And I remember I had this little moment, I'm like, I'm not working for him. I'm working with him. It was so subtle, but it was so real. I'm like, this is good. I actually like my dad. Not that I didn't before. It was like I wasn't being antagonistic. Like, he's not making me do something that like is just torturesome, or as if I were some slave. I'm like, I'm a son. I'm not merely working for him. I'm working with him. We're working together. With Christian obedience, when Jesus gives this story about these two sons, we can kind of easily see ourselves in it. Our father or mother says, hey, could you do this? We're like, yes. And then we go some other way. Or when we start saying like, no, and we actually start doing it. Like, something has happened where with obedience, one of the most insightful things I've ever heard is from St. Augustine. And St. Augustine, when he talks about salvation, he says, he gave me the best definition of salvation. St. Augustine said, salvation is a communion of wills. Oh my God, it's so simple. Salvation is a communion of wills. Not where you're batting up against each other like, I just have to work for the man upstairs. It's not obedience. St. Augustine said, the greatest freedom is for those who obey out of a desire to be with God. That's salvation. Salvation, like true obedience, is where I'm not just working for God. I don't just have to do antagonistically against what God's rules as if it were like a punishment. It's like there's actually the greatest freedom is when I am having communion with God, who's pure goodness. He doesn't hold anything against us. That word struck me as I was doing a Lectio Divina with the readings this Sunday, when Jesus says, a man had two sons, and he said to one, son, not slave, not worker, not hired person, not one who I enjoy giving difficult tasks to. Son, come work in the vineyard today. The invitation of God is always an invitation to the communion of life with his will. So why do we fight against it so much? My sister Teresa, younger sister Teresa, she has a little daughter named Jane. She's almost 3 years old. And my sister Teresa will send me like little videos of like life with her little daughter. She loves it. And she showed me a video a few weeks ago of Jane helping her carry groceries out from the car. And she's like this 3-year-old, but she's like carrying the grapes in from the grocery store. Like, Mom, I'm helping you. And I was like, this is so great. Then the other week she sent me a video where she said, Jane, could you help me take in the groceries? And Jane was like, no! There's something so instinctual, even as a 3-year-old, to be like, as soon as someone like, it's okay if it's our idea to carry in the groceries. And then when someone says, hey, can you help us? Or this is your job, this is now your chore. There's something that immediately kind of clouds and gives us great suspicion, like, I'm somehow becoming less by doing another's will. I certainly am, maybe I'm losing my autonomy by doing another's will. Obedience, rather, in the Christian life is a freeing thing. It lifts us out of our wayward ways, and sometimes we don't know how wayward we are in our own choices until moments like, again, I can joke about when I was 12. I'd always known that being around skunks wasn't a good idea, but it just kind of went right past me. It doesn't matter how old or how young we are. The error of sin is always deceptive. It's always by definition deceptive. That life is somehow better when I'm doing my own will rather than God's. So obedience is meant to actually free us. And it's the communion of wills. So have that be something that you take to heart, that God, who is pure goodness, never enjoys just seeing us in pain or seeing us just being grounded, so to speak, just to have us have a punishment. God is pure goodness. And the freedom of Jesus will always be incredibly elusive to us who prefer our own ways. Now, if you go through the Gospels, you'll see many things that are quite unpopular to be obedient about. There's, of course, sexual ethics. There's moral choices about how to deal with possessions. There's who we choose to love and how we choose to love. How we speak and use the tongue. There's all sorts of Christian principles. Ephesians 4, for example, says, whatever you say, let it be edifying. It's like, oh, to be obedient to that seems like I'm getting boxed in. I can't be me. Obedience, rather, is when I stop fighting against it and actually starts freeing me to be like, I'm not working for God, I'm working with Him. Last Monday, I went fly fishing on the upper Mississippi with a couple of priest friends of mine. And so we were on the Mississippi, and for a while we were paddling upstream. It's very hard to do that, especially when you're in a kayak. And it just was occurring to me, like once we kind of turned around and went, the wind was with us, the current was with us. It's like, this is so easy when I'm actually not fighting against it, but going with it. And I don't know why it's so hard. I mean, there's plenty of reasons we could say, but for every one of us, whether we're 3 years old or we're 97 years old, there will always be something in our human spirit that's fighting against being obedient to God because it makes me feel like I'm going to be something less, or it's not free. But rather, when I'm going with the current, so to speak, the will of God, and I'm going with the wind of the Holy Spirit, why am I not doing this in the first place? This is so much easier when I stop fighting against it. And I would imagine that as all of us have come into Mass today, if you were to take this week 10 minutes of silence, pure silence, and you were just to sit with the living, loving God, you would probably hear some place where the Lord is whispering in your conscience to listen to Him, where previously we've been suppressing it, pushing it down, go away from me, escaping, numbing it, all the while thinking we're far more free if we're just getting away from it. I encourage you this week to take at least 10 minutes of silence and say, speak, Lord. Your servant, your son, your daughter is listening. And I want to be obedient to whatever that whisper is beckoning me towards. I dare you. I encourage you. I exhort you. And I wonder if by experience you might start to taste, I'm not merely working for God. I'm working with my Father, who calls me His son and His daughter. Amen?